Let's talk about one of the most underrated technological gaps of World War II. When most people think about strategic bombing in World War II, they picture the European theatre, RAF Lancasters pounding Hamburg, B-17s fighting their way through flak over Schweinfurt, Germany's bombers blitzing London. It's dramatic, it's well documented, and it gets most of the attention. But here's the thing. While all of that was happening, the United States was quietly developing something that made every other bomber in the war, Allied or Axis, look like it belonged to a different era entirely. The B-29 Superfortress. And when you actually sit down and compare it to what Germany was flying, the HE-111, the DO-217, the Ju-88, even the ambitious but troubled HE-177, the gap isn't just noticeable, it's staggering. So today, let's dig into why. Not just the specs, though the specs are genuinely wild, but the thinking behind the aircraft, the engineering challenges both sides faced, and what it actually meant in practice when these machines went to war. To understand why the B-29 was so far ahead, you first need to understand what Germany and the United States were trying to do with bombers in the first place. Because they had very different goals. Germany, for most of the war, was fighting a land war in Europe. Their air force, the Luftwaffe, was built around supporting ground troops, conducting tactical strikes, and hitting targets relatively close to home. Britain is right across the channel. The Soviet Union's industrial centers, while far, were still reachable with medium bombers. Germany never seriously committed to building a true, strategic heavy bomber capable of hitting targets thousands of miles away. Part of that was doctrine. The Luftwaffe's early leadership, particularly Ernst Udet, pushed hard for dive bombing capability on almost every aircraft. That sounds fine until you realize you can't make a massive four-engine heavy bomber also pull out of a dive without tearing the wings off. It fundamentally limited what German designers could do. Part of it was also resources. Germany was stretched. Steel, aluminum, fuel, trained pilots, all of it was being rationed between competing priorities. Building a fleet of long-range heavy bombers required a commitment of industrial resources that Germany simply never made in a sustained way. The United States, on the other hand, was fighting a war where distance was the central problem. Japan was across the Pacific. Even after capturing island bases, you're still looking at missions covering thousands of miles over open ocean. You needed an aircraft that could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything that existed, and carry enough bombs to make the trip worth it. That demand created the B-29. And honestly, once you see what it took to build it, you start to appreciate just how ambitious the whole project was. Okay, let's get into the specifics, but I'll keep this readable rather than just throwing a wall of data at you. The B-29 had a maximum range of around 3,250 miles. That's the distance from New York to London, roughly. It cruised at about 220 miles per hour and could push to 357 miles per hour at altitude. Its service ceiling, the maximum altitude it could effectively operate at, was around 31,000 feet. That's nearly 6 miles up. Now compare that to Germany's most capable bombers. The Heinkel He 177, which was Germany's attempt at a proper heavy bomber, had a range of about 1,200 miles fully loaded. That's less than a third of the B-29's range. Its service ceiling was around 26,000 feet, and its maximum speed was roughly 295 miles per hour. Respectable. But the HE-177 was also plagued by so many mechanical problems that Luftwaffe crews gave it a nickname, the Flaming Coffin. More on that in a minute. The Junkers Ju-88 one of Germany's most versatile and widely used aircraft, had a range of around 1,100 to 1,700 miles, depending on the variant and load. Fast for its time, agile, reliable, but fundamentally a medium bomber. Not in the same category. The Heinkel He 111, the backbone of German bombing operations early in the war, had a range of about 750 miles with a full bomb load. Its service ceiling was around 21,000 feet. By 1943, it was already obsolete for anything other than transport duties. The Dornier Du 217 was a more capable successor, with better range and load capacity than the HE 111, but it still maxed out well below the B-29 in every meaningful category. So the raw numbers are clear, but numbers alone don't tell the full story. Here's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention when people talk about the B-29. It had a pressurized cabin. This sounds like a comfort feature, and sure, it was more comfortable than freezing at 30,000 feet in an unpressurized aircraft. But it was much more than that. When you fly at high altitude without pressurization, your crew has to wear oxygen masks for the entire mission. At 25,000 feet and above, every crew member is managing their oxygen supply, dealing with the cognitive effects of altitude, and working in temperatures that can hit minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Fine motor skills deteriorate. Decision-making slows. Fatigue sets in faster. The B-29's pressurized forward and rear crew compartments, connected by a long pressurized tunnel running over the bomb bays, meant crews could work in something approaching a normal environment. No oxygen masks during cruise, better alertness, less physical exhaustion on long missions. This mattered enormously on a 14 or 15-hour mission over the Pacific. A crew arriving over their target, exhausted and oxygen-deprived, performs very differently from a crew that's been able to function normally for most of the flight. German bombers were not pressurized, with very limited exceptions. The HE 177 had some pressurization work done on certain variants, but it was never standard and never approached what the B-29 offered. And this connects to a broader point. The B-29 wasn't just designed to fly far and fast. It was designed to keep its crew functional enough to actually do their job when they got there. Let's spend some time with the HE 177 because it deserves attention. It's genuinely one of the most fascinating failure stories in aviation history. On paper, the HE 177 Grafe means Griffin, was supposed to be Germany's answer to long-range strategic bombing. It was a large, powerful aircraft with 4 engines. Well, technically, 4 engines arranged as 2 coupled pairs, which is where things start to get complicated. Ernst Heinkel designed the aircraft in the late 1930s. The original specifications called for it to be capable of dive bombing. Yes, dive bombing. A heavy bomber. The Luftwaffe procurement establishment was so committed to this idea that it was written into the requirements, and rather than simply having the aircraft fly level and drop bombs like a sensible heavy bomber, designers had to build in structural strength to handle dive angles. This drove the coupled engine arrangement. Instead of 4 separate engines on 4 separate nacelles, the standard approach, the He 177 paired 2 engines together, driving a single propeller through a complicated gearbox. The idea was to reduce drag. The reality was a maintenance nightmare that generated catastrophic amounts of heat. The engines caught fire, regularly, not occasionally, regularly. Crews reported that the engine nacelles would start smoking during flight. Sometimes the fires were manageable, sometimes they weren't. The aircraft was losing crews not to enemy fighters or flak, but to its own engines bursting into flames. Multiple redesigns attempted to fix this, Some improvements were made, but the fundamental problem, paired engines creating excessive heat with inadequate cooling, was never fully solved. The aircraft flew combat missions, particularly on the Eastern Front and against Allied shipping, but it never came close to fulfilling its original strategic bombing role. Compare this to the B-29's development. The B-29 had serious problems of its own. The Wright R-3350 engines had overheating issues that killed crews during testing, but Boeing and the USAAF pushed through those problems with an almost reckless industrial urgency. The aircraft entered production before it had finished flight testing under a program sometimes called the $3 billion gamble. By the time crews were flying combat missions, most of the major issues had been addressed, though engine fires remained a concern throughout the war. The difference was commitment. The United States decided the B-29 was going to work and threw resources at it until it did. Germany never gave the He-177 that same focused, priority-level attention. Let's talk payload, because this is where the operational impact becomes very concrete. The B-29 could carry a bomb load of up to 20,000 pounds. On long-range missions, the practical load was often lower, around 12,000 to 16,000 pounds, because you needed the fuel. But even at reduced loads, this was an enormous amount of destructive capacity. The He-177, at its best, could carry around 13,000 pounds of bombs, which is actually competitive on paper. But given its range limitations and the fact that many He-177s were kept out of service due to mechanical issues, the effective operational payload, what you could reliably count on delivery, was far lower. The He-111 carried around 4,400 pounds in normal operations, occasionally pushing to heavier loads on short missions with reduced fuel. The Ju-88 carried roughly 3,900 to 6,600 pounds, depending on variant. The Do-217 could manage around 8,800 pounds, so the B-29's payload advantage was real. But more important was the combination of range and payload. You could put a substantial bomb load on target from a base that was far beyond the reach of enemy fighters and most anti-aircraft defenses. That's the key. During the firebombing campaign against Japan that began in earnest in early 1945, B-29s were dropping incendiary bombs on Japanese cities with devastating effect. The March 9th to 10th, 1945 raid on Tokyo, Operation Meeting House, sent nearly 300 B-29s over the city at low altitude, dropping incendiaries. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed roughly 16 square miles of the city. No German bomber, and frankly, no German bomber fleet in any realistic wartime configuration, could have mounted an operation of that scale against a target that far from any available base. This is one of the coolest technical details of the B-29, and it's one that often gets overlooked. The aircraft had a remote-controlled defensive gun system. Rather than gunners sitting in exposed turrets in the freezing cold, the traditional approach, B-29 gunners operated from pressurized sighting stations inside the aircraft, using remote controls to aim and fire turrets located at various points on the fuselage. The system used a central fire control computer, one of the earliest uses of analog computing in a combat aircraft. Multiple gunners could track different targets simultaneously, and the system could even allow one gunner to take control of multiple turrets if needed. The computer made deflection calculations, basically figuring out how far ahead of a moving target you need to aim automatically. This was genuinely revolutionary for its time. German bombers, by contrast, used conventional manually operated gun positions. Gunners sat in exposed or semi-exposed positions, aimed mechanically, and fired directly. Effective enough in the early war years, but increasingly inadequate as fighter aircraft became faster and more maneuverable. The B-29 system wasn't perfect. It had reliability issues, and Japanese fighter pilots found ways to attack from angles that reduced its effectiveness. But it represented a fundamental advance in thinking about bomber defense, moving away from simply putting more gunners in more positions and toward using technology to make each gunner more effective. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The B-29's operational ceiling of around 31,000 feet wasn't just impressive. In the context of 1944 and 1945, it was genuinely difficult to reach. Most German and Japanese fighter aircraft struggled to perform effectively above 30,000 feet. Engine output drops significantly at altitude. You're working with thinner air, which means less combustion efficiency. Maneuverability decreases. Pilots face oxygen challenges even with masks. The whole combat performance envelope shrinks. Operating at high altitude meant the B-29 was, at least in theory, able to fly above many of the defenses it might otherwise face. The anti-aircraft guns that devastated low-altitude bombers were mostly ineffective at 30,000 feet. Fighters that were lethal at 20,000 feet were sluggish and underpowered at 31,000. The irony is that in practice, the high-altitude precision bombing campaign against Japan didn't work as well as planners hoped. The jet stream over Japan, which wasn't fully understood at the time, caused winds of 150 miles per hour or more at high altitude, scattering bombs and making accuracy nearly impossible. This is actually what drove the shift to low-altitude night incendiary raids under General Curtis LeMay. That turned out to be devastatingly effective, even if it sacrificed the altitude protection. But the point remains, the B-29 had options. It could choose its attack profile in a way that no German bomber could. That flexibility is itself a form of capability. You can't talk about why the B-29 was so dominant without talking about what it took to build it. The B-29 program was the most expensive weapons development project in American history during World War II, more expensive at the time than the Manhattan Project. Over $3 billion was spent on development and production, which in modern terms represents something close to $50 billion. More than 3,900 B-29s were built during the war. Think about that for a second. Nearly 4,000 of these massive, technologically sophisticated aircraft rolling off assembly lines in Wichita, Kansas, and Marietta, Georgia. Germany never built anything close to this for its heavy bomber programs. Total He-177 production was around 1,169 aircraft, and a significant portion of those spent much of their service lives grounded for repairs. The production numbers for the Do-217 were around 1,900, but again, a medium bomber, not a heavy. The United States had something Germany fundamentally lacked by 1943, industrial capacity that was safe from enemy attack and growing rather than shrinking. American factories in the Midwest weren't being bombed. Workers weren't being drafted to fight. The supply chains of aluminum, steel, copper, and rubber were functioning. Germany's industrial situation was the opposite. Allied strategic bombing, much of it delivered by those same B-17S and B-24S and Lancasters everyone knows about, was progressively degrading German production capacity. Fuel shortages were crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to train pilots and fly missions. By 1944 and 1945, Germany was producing aircraft faster than it could train pilots to fly them, and flying missions without the fuel to provide meaningful training. The B-29 exists in a context of American industrial abundance that Germany simply couldn't match. The aircraft itself is remarkable, but it's also a product of a system, an economy, an industrial base, a supply chain that had no German equivalent. There's a human element here that's easy to overlook when you're focused on the machines. Operating a B-29 required a crew of 11 men and demanded a significant level of technical training. The aircraft's systems were complex. The pressurization, the remote fire control, the long-range navigation, the engine management. Pilots needed to understand fuel management in detail because miscalculations over the Pacific could mean ditching hundreds of miles from rescue. The United States invested heavily in training programs. The Army Air Forces built a training infrastructure that processed tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. By the time the B-29 entered combat, in 1944, there was an established system for producing crews who understood their aircraft thoroughly. Germany's training pipeline was collapsing. Fuel shortages meant training flight hours were being cut. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. By the final year of the war, German pilots were sometimes going into combat with a fraction of the flight hours that American crews had accumulated. This matters more than people often appreciate. A technically advanced aircraft flown by a poorly trained crew performs significantly worse than a simpler aircraft flown by an experienced one. The combination of a highly capable aircraft and well-trained crews made the B-29 force genuinely formidable in a way that raw specifications can't fully capture. Everything we've talked about became concrete in the Pacific from 1944 onward. The first B-29 combat missions launched from bases in India and China in June 1944. The logistics were nightmarish, flying fuel and supplies over the hump of the Himalayas just to keep the aircraft operational. Early results were mixed. The logistics chain limited how often and how effectively the aircraft could be used. The real shift came with the capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, in mid-1944. These islands were roughly 1,500 miles from the Japanese home islands, perfect B-29 range. Tinian in particular became one of the most intensely used airbases in history, with aircraft taking off at intervals of just a few minutes during major raids. From the Marianas, the B-29 campaign against Japan escalated dramatically. The shift to low-altitude night raids under LeMay in early 1945 turned strategic bombing into something genuinely devastating. Japan's cities, built heavily of wood and paper, were extraordinarily vulnerable to incendiary attack. The bombing campaign destroyed large portions of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities. And then, of course, there's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Enola Gay and Bockscar, the two B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs, were not specially designed aircraft. They were modified production B-29s. The fact that the aircraft capable of delivering the world's first atomic weapons in combat was a production model tells you something about the platform's capability. No German bomber was remotely suitable for this role. Not in range, not in ceiling, not in payload capacity, not in the precision of delivery. So could Germany have built something comparable to the B-29? It's worth asking the question. There were German projects that pointed in interesting directions. The Junkers Ju-390, which flew a test flight in 1943 that reportedly reached the vicinity of New York, though this claim is debated by historians, showed that German engineers understood long-range flight. The Messerschmitt Me 264 was designed specifically as an intercontinental bomber capable of reaching the United States. It flew in prototype form but never entered production. The Focke-Wulf Tar 400 was a six-engine heavy bomber design that might have been genuinely capable if developed fully. It didn't progress past design stages. What stopped these programs wasn't primarily technical inability. German aeronautical engineers were among the best in the world. The jet aircraft and rocket programs demonstrated that clearly. What stopped them was a combination of strategic priorities, resource constraints, and leadership decisions that consistently favored fighters, tactical aircraft, and wonder weapons over the sustained development of conventional heavy bombers. There's also the question of what such aircraft would have targeted. Germany's potential strategic bombing targets in 1944 and 1945, American industrial cities, were simply too far away for anything Germany could realistically have built and operated given its resource situation. You can design a long-range bomber, but you also need the fuel to fly it, the bases to fly it from, and the industrial capacity to build it in meaningful numbers. The B-29 program required American industrial might and American geographic security to exist. Germany had neither by the time it might have needed such an aircraft. The B-29 didn't just win the war in the Pacific, it reshaped how people thought about air power. The aircraft's direct descendants include the B-50 Superfortress, which served into the 1950s, and the B-52 Stratofortress, which entered service in 1955 and, remarkably, is still flying today, still being upgraded, still considered a viable combat aircraft. The DNA of thinking that produced the B-29, long-range, high-altitude, massive payload, sophisticated systems, crew comfort as a performance factor, runs through American strategic bombing doctrine straight to the present day. The Soviet Union was so impressed by B-29s that force landed in Siberia during the war that they reverse-engineered the aircraft entirely, producing the Tupolev Tu-4. This is one of the more remarkable stories in aviation history. The Soviets copied the aircraft down to individual rivets, including, by some accounts, the cigarette lighter in the cockpit. German bomber design, by contrast, had relatively little post-war influence. The approach, medium bombers with limited range, built for tactical and operational rather than strategic missions, was a dead end in the nuclear age. Strategic air power in the Cold War looked much more like a B-29 than a HE-111. So here's where we land. The B-29 wasn't better than German bombers because of one brilliant innovation or one lucky decision. It was better because of an accumulation of advantages. In range, altitude, payload, crew systems, fire control, industrial production, training, and strategic doctrine that reflected a fundamentally different approach to what strategic air power should be. Germany built bombers for the war it expected to fight, a European land war where air support meant hitting targets a few hundred miles away. The United States built the B-29 for a war it wasn't even sure it would fight, a conflict across vast ocean distances requiring aircraft capabilities that didn't exist yet. That kind of forward-looking ambition, backed by the industrial capacity to actually execute it, is what produced the B-29. And once it was in the field, there was simply nothing in the Luftwaffe's inventory that could operate in the same league. The HE-177 caught fire on the way to the target. The B-29 was already over Japan. If you found this interesting, there's a lot more to dig into. The specific campaigns over Japan, the engineering details of the B-29's pressurization system, the story of the Enola Gay's crew, or the fascinating parallel story of why the British Lancaster was actually excellent at its own very different job. Let me know in the comments which direction you'd like to go, and if you haven't already, subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of deep dive military history coming. See you in the next one.